know who you are. That's step one,
Mm-hmm.
right? A lot of times that comes through trauma or something like that's where you really figure out your survival information that you are uniquely there to give. Your job is you need to know who you are so you know what to stand for, right? Because your philosophy is up here, and out of that comes your tactics. Out of that
Right.
comes the rules or whatever.
In this episode, Brian and Jesse break down how having conviction, knowing who you are and what you stand for, is the difference between creating something timely and creating something timeless.
So today we want to talk about the importance of having a personal philosophy, right?
Yeah.
And so this came from, we always get confused between what we shot and what we didn't because we're just talking like this all the time.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other day we were talking about this and we were talking about philosophy and you were saying that people, like all the greats, had a philosophy. They used to have something that they were working from. Will you kind of talk about what you meant by philosophy?
People had a conviction. I mean, now people have convictions, but their convictions are, I think, sometimes fashionable, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody's doing this. This is what you do. And often those people are uncovered as fake and not really meaning it. And,
Yeah.
so that's not a real conviction. I'm talking about a real sense of what it means to be a human being, and your responsibility to other human beings. And I think that people used to think that mattered in a different way. And maybe that's coming around again, and maybe we're seeing that now. I don't know. But I think for a long time it went away. And so, but if you think about it from a storytelling perspective and a craft perspective, it informs what you do. If Rod Serling goes to World War II and sees a lot of death, which he did in World War II, in the Philippines, when you do that and it affects you and impacts you, when he comes back and says, "I don't want to kill another living thing," and I see what hate can do. I see what it does to people. I see. Well, that's how you get the Twilight Zone, right? That's how you get a thing that is, no matter how old it gets, still always finds a new generation of fans because there are universal truths in there that have nothing to do with the time that they were written. People are always. It's amazing to me that people always say this, but some old thing will come back and they'll say, it seems like it's so timely, it's like, it's still timely. It's like, it's not timely, it's timeless. And that's the difference. If you're trying to do something timely, you will fail. If you try to do something timeless, it will always work. People always have the same motivations. They don't change. 1,000 years, 2,000 years, people are the same. You can hear a story that's 2,000 years old.
Same three things.
Yeah, right. Get food, don't become food, make little versions of yourself, right? Those are the three things that any story is going to be about on some level. I mean, people who think literally will think that means literally all those things, and it doesn't necessarily mean them literally. Get food is, being successful and surviving and whatever. Yeah. And, don't become food is about not being a victim, not becoming how you not be victimized, right?
Well, Baxter's problem in the apartment was get food.
Right.
Right. He's like, if I can just get that executive washroom, that's get food.
That's get food. Yeah. Right. But also make little versions of yourself, right? That can look like love. That can look like. Goodwill
Hunting is make little versions of yourself. Robin Williams made a little version of it, like he. Right.
Yes. It can be a mentor. It can be a teacher. Right. Yeah. So that's it. It's all some version of that. Yeah. And so, and sometimes there are things that you go, well, I wouldn't do that for, like see Baxter in the apartment, realizes that, well, you know what? I might have to starve because my principles are bigger than that. There are some things you won't do.
Yep.
right? There are some things you won't do, but that's principle, right?
Yeah.
I remember the movie Three Kings. It's weird to talk about actual movies because then I end up meeting people or who wrote that thing, or it's like, oh yeah, I talked publicly about your thing. But I'm going to talk about Three Kings. So in that movie, these soldiers are in the first sort of Gulf War, they're stealing Saddam Hussein's gold. And I only saw the movie once when it came out, so the details are a little fuzzy to me. But at one point, they go through all this trouble to get this gold out, and then there's a checkpoint at the very end of the movie where if they're going to get caught with this gold, and so there's some refugees, and so somehow I can't remember now, but they're able to get that gold to the refugees and help them. And it's supposed to be like a self-sacrifice, like they did the right thing and they helped these refugees and they didn't take the gold and all of that. Except that's a lie. They're not heroes. They saved themselves. They were going to get caught and get in trouble. So they gave the better way to write that is they get through with their gold. And then give it to the
and then they give that's great. I think Spike did that, right?
Yeah. That's the better way to write it because that makes them heroic.
Then it's an actual survival. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so there was something lacking in the conviction of the people making that piece. Right? If you save yourself, well, that's not heroic. Right. Yeah. It just isn't. Yeah. They were thieves about to get caught, so they basically we'll give it to them, and it was supposed to make us feel like they were good guys, and I didn't feel that. And is
it Gunga Din? Is that how you say it, George Stevens movie? Right, where when he plays the trumpet,
right?
So that's self-sacrifice,
right?
You know what I mean? It's when
he knows he's going to get shot.
He knows he's going to
Yeah, he'll know he get killed, but yeah. So that's a different thing. So I think when you don't have convictions, it can make you make bad stories because you'll do what's convenient, you'll do what's funny, or you'll do what's clever. It's like I've said this about the Andy Griffith Show, but on his show, he used to say, if a joke makes a liar out of the character, then lose the joke. Right? It was more important that the show have an internal integrity and be honest and tell the truth than be funny at that moment. And if you watch the show, it's not always funny. There are times when there are scenes, it's a comedy, but there are scenes where there's no jokes at all. Yeah. Because that's not what the story needs right there, and to do anything else would be a lie.
Yep.
Right? But Andy had strong convictions. Really strong convictions.
And people still love that show.
Yeah, they do.
It's still the Andy Griffith Show.
Yeah.
So let's look at George Stevens, because he's a really interesting character to talk about from this perspective. You talk about Rod Serling a lot. George Stevens is a guy that not enough people talk about.
That's true.
Well, George Stevens, consider this: Laurel and Hardy, Diary of Anne Frank.
Right.
Same guy.
Right.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Let me just say, but so here's the thing. Unfortunately, I mentioned Laurel and Hardy to people who are younger. They have no idea who they are.
Oh, okay.
But Laurel and Hardy were a comedy team, starting in the silent movies. And actually, George Stevens was a photographer first, so he actually photographed their movies before he was directing. But they were a silent movie comedy team that actually successfully made the transition to sound. A lot of people didn't, but they did. And we're fairly successful comedy team. They were.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that you couldn't get bigger. Really.
I would think. Yeah, I would think they were fairly it's Laurel and Hardy. It's like if you know the Three Stooges. I guess maybe if people don't know Three Stooges, there's other guys like Fatty Arbuckle. Like Laurel and Hardy is awesome. And I bet if you saw a caricature of them, you'd probably go, "Oh, I've seen them before."
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a little like Chaplin. People who they've never seen a Chaplin movie, but they know who he is. I think people would know the image of Laurel and Hardy without knowing who they are. I don't know how their stuff translates now to an audience because it's, you know, it's slapstick, so it's a little violent and all those things.
Yeah.
So it might not hit the same way.
Yeah.
But
I still think it's funny. It's amazing.
They're hilarious. They're hilarious.
Yeah.
But anyway,
okay. But George Stevens was known for comedies,
mm-hmm.
right? And then he signed up like the day that war broke out. He like signed up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he was in Europe, and his whole thing was documenting D-Day, things like that. He was actually the one that documented Dachau. So if you've ever seen the footage from Dachau, George Stevens was shooting that. So he saw everything, right?
Yeah.
He saw the worst of what humans are capable of. And when he came back, it changed the way he made movies.
Yeah.
For
And
instance,
I'm sorry. I was going to say it's important to note, you know, we're used to seeing that footage. We've seen that Holocaust footage.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, when they went to those camps, they had no idea how bad things were going to be. Like, it hit people hard. Yeah. They were the first people outside of that experience to see it, and it hit them really hard. Yeah. And George Stevens, you know, his job was to document what was happening during the war. And when they got to the camp and saw what they saw, he at a certain point, he realized that he was getting evidence for war crimes. He knew that this was more than just historical footage, that this was evidence of war crimes. And so he was shooting it that way, with that in mind. So at that moment, there was a conviction. Wait, these are war crimes. Somebody's going to be tried for this, and I'm collecting evidence. So at that moment, he knew, you know, that it was important, and it probably changed him then.
Yeah.
You know, he came back changed, and I wouldn't be surprised that if that's what did it. There's lots of stories of guys seeing a lot of horrible things and then seeing those death camps and being like, I mean, imagine going through a whole war and seeing all manner of death and destruction, and then getting someplace that was even worse. Yeah.
I mean, the crazy thing is, there's some really amazing quotes. There's if you want to learn more about him, there's a really great documentary his son did, George Stevens Jr. did, and like Katharine Hepburn's in it, like everybody's in it. It's crazy. But they talk about, there's a quote from his dad, and his dad pretty much said, when he was seeing all this happen, the thing that he was struggling with was, he had this story where he told like this old man was like begging and like grabbing at him, and how all he wanted to do was get away from the guy and like kick him and push him away. And he was like, I hate Nazis. He says, the quote is something like, I hate those bastards, but I also realized that I had that in me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when I was pushing that old man away, I have the potential to do what they did.
Right.
And I thought that was also really amazing that he said that, that he was thinking that way. But here's how it translates into something like Shane, right? So he goes to make Shane, which is a classic if you haven't seen Shane.
Classic Western. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And he said that, I actually wrote it down. The actual quote was, he was talking about the gun, and he said, I didn't want to give this weapon grace, but to show it for what it was, a weapon of destruction. And so what he did was he was firing like cannonballs into like garbage cans. So when you hear the gunshots in Shane, that was because he wasn't trying to do what everybody else in Westerns was doing, which is, look how cool, you know, like John Wayne is, and, you know, 6-shooters. He was trying to show the weapon for what it was, which was destroying human beings, right? And it was crazy because Warren Beatty even ended up noticing that.
Yeah, and using it in Bonnie and Clyde. He used it in Bonnie and Clyde. Did you know the story about that? The Bonnie and Clyde? Yeah, where he...
Tell it.
Yeah, so he wanted, you know, the gunshots sound bigger than normal gunshots because it's about communicating that idea of violence.
Yeah, destruction,
Yeah, and so Warren Beatty did that years later in Bonnie and Clyde, and he's sitting in the screening room, or but in the theater when it's first being projected for an audience, and the gunshots are quiet, and he can't figure out what's going on, and they're quiet, and finally he runs up to the projectionist. He's like, "What's going on?" And he goes, the projectionist says something like, "Hey kid, I saved you. You know, your gunshots were way too loud, and so I've been adjusting it. And I haven't seen a movie mix this bad since Shane."
Exactly. It's awesome. Warren Beatty tells that story. It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
But it's cool because like that's how your philosophy That's how you translate real life and what you've seen, right, into your work.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want normal gunshots. Why? I want people to understand that this person's being destroyed and that this piece of metal he's holding is a cannon and it destroys people.
Yeah.
I don't want and you go like, God, that it sounds like a little thing, that sound effect thing. It sounds like a little thing. It's not.
It's not.
That's a master. That's a master knowing exactly what he's doing, and he's working from something.
Right.
Right? He's working from this core conviction and philosophy.
Right. I mean, it's one thing because what you hear often is the surface of it. Like I want the gun to be really loud, right? You might hear that. But the why of it, you never hear anymore, right?
Yeah.
That's an older way of thinking, it seems to me. I will say this, that working with people who work in animation so much, they seem to be much more deliberate, actually, than live action people often are, in my experience.
Help me understand that. What do you mean by that?
Well, I remember I was at DreamWorks when they were doing. I was on a tour when they were doing Prince of Egypt, and they were doing El Dorado. And I remember there was a guy doing layouts and in the jungle for El Dorado, and he goes, Road to El Dorado, is that what it's called? Yeah, I think that's whatever it's called. People will know, and they'll write it down below. But by then I'll know. But anyway, so there were all these leaves in the jungle and trees and branches and stuff, and he's like, "Oh yeah, my job here is to figure out how to get all the leaves and all the branches and everything to lead your eye to this spot where the action's going to be, but it can't look like that's what I'm doing." Right? That kind of deliberate thing I see more, and I'm used to having those conversations more with animation people.
That's interesting.
Yeah, than live action people. Maybe because everything has to be created, right? It's a different thing, right? You can't go to a location in animation. You have to create the location, right? Yeah. So maybe that's why. I don't know. Also, I think that animation is already an abstraction. And so because it's already an abstraction, maybe it's easier for people to think in terms of abstraction with animation than with live action. But people used to think more abstractly, I think, with live action than they do now.
Well, it's the why piece you're talking about is so huge. And I hope the big question everybody can take away from this episode, or at least try to get people to start thinking about, is like, what is your philosophy? Right? It's the whole know who you are so you know what to do. Right. When you know who you are, you know what to do. Because George Stevens knew who he was, he knew what to do. Yeah. This gun has to sound like this because it's not true that guns are fun and what, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, Billy Wilder, know who you are, know what to do. Like that story, there's Billy Wilder's Lifetime Achievement speech is crazy. And I think we've talked about it before, right?
I'm not sure. You can talk about it again. It's different context.
But so the story is, actually, you want to tell the story? You probably know it even better than I do.
No, I think you probably know better than I do.
So
I think you heard it more recently.
Amazing. I think that it's easily the best acceptance speech I've ever seen. It's tied with Mr. Rogers. There's another acceptance speech where Mr. Rogers makes you take a minute and think about everyone that loves you. That's crazy. Yeah. If you haven't seen that one, look it up. But outside of that, Billy Wilder's Lifetime Achievement speech, he dedicated the Lifetime Achievement Award to a person he didn't know their name. He's like, I'm dedicating this to someone whose name I do not know. And it was, so he was here, he fled Germany, he got out, he barely got out. Like, I think there were people on his way to his house, right? Like, Billy, like, barely got out of Germany.
Yeah, he went...
at least from what he said in the speech.
Oh, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I know that he got out as soon as it was possible for, because he thought, this Hitler guy is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. He said he, like, threw stuff in a suitcase because he thought people were coming. And so, like, later on it becomes important because he doesn't have papers with him. So he gets to America and he's here working and he has to go and he has to get a visa to stay. And so you have to go to an American, like, embassy in order to get the stamp, right? And so he goes down to, I think it was Tijuana, because he was in LA. Yeah. And he goes down there and he's sitting there and he's getting grilled by this guy who's either going to kind of
Because
stamp
yeah,
it.
he had to leave the country, right, and then
You have
come
to
back
leave the
in.
country in order to come back in.
Yeah.
Now, if he doesn't get his passport stamped, it's back to Germany. And he says, I'm telling you, he's like, if he doesn't stamp this, I'm back to Germany. I'm on a train to Dachau. That's it. He's like, that's what will happen.
Well, his family died at Auschwitz. So his family did die at Auschwitz. So
like, these are the stakes for the guy. And the guy's asking him, where's your paperwork? And he's explaining, I had to get, I got out as fast as I could. I don't have any paperwork. It's all in Germany. And the guy's grilling him, and Billy's like talking about how he's like sweating. He's like, this is it for me. Like, I'm done. And then the guy ends up asking him, he goes like, what do you do for a living? And he said, I write pictures. And it's funny. I'm telling the story, and I'm trying to get emotional. It's crazy just thinking about it for me. And he goes, and he said he just looked at him for a minute, and then he stamped his passport and he handed it to him instead, write some good ones. And Billy said, that's what I've been trying to do every day since. Like that, when you see him tell that story and dedicate a lifetime of work to somebody, like that kindness piece is insane.
yeah.
And the way that we treat immigrants, I mean, anyways, like, but if you think about Billy fucking Wilder, we would have never had him if not for the kindness of one stranger.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that. But Billy came back and he wrote some fucking good movies.
Yeah.
When you have that kind of like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Conviction, watch what happens.
Well, he also was he really liked telling the truth, Billy Wilder. And we've talked about this a little bit, but people often confuse facts with truth,
Mm-hmm.
So but telling the truth in a very specific way. And one of my favorite quotes of his is about how why he put the camera where he put it. He didn't like the idea of putting a camera someplace because it looked cool if you were shooting through here or you were in the fireplace doing, but he's like, whose point of view is it? Didn't make any sense to him. And he was always very proud that what he said is there are no phony shots in my movies. Meaning there are no shots that are not motivated by the story. That's a conviction, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to lie for the benefit of getting attention to how good of a director I am or whatever, or look how clever I am because I put the camera here instead of here or whatever. That was never, you almost don't notice what he does with the camera, but it's actually a pretty amazing thing what he does.
It's unbelievable, man.
Yeah.
It's like, what was that movie we were talking about? It's the one with Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. It's a football one.
Oh, Fortune Cookie.
Fortune Cookie.
Yeah.
If you know what you're looking at, he could stack a shot. So he could accomplish in one shot things that would have taken people 3 or 4 setups.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some work in that movie that's it's every one of his movies. But when you talk about that, like, he always put the camera in the most economical, like, it's like the perfect spot.
Yeah.
It's crazy. But if you watch the Fortune Cookie, watch specifically for the scene where Jack Lemmon gets hurt. And watch how he proves that Jack Lemmon was hurt. So there's a point at the beginning of the movie where he gets hit by a football player. He's a camera operator, and Billy's got a problem. He's like, how do I show people that he didn't just fall down, that he's really hurt? Watch how he solves that problem in one single shot. It's crazy. So there's your homework. I'm just saying, that dude, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable because you don't even notice how perfect. Mm-hmm. It's like music. Like, once you see what he does in one shot, I'm telling you, if I did it, it would take me 3 setups.
Sure.
Right? But what Billy did in one shot to tell you all the information you need to know without everybody saying anything, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And he did that all the time.
Yeah, he did. But, knowing that his job was to communicate, right? He was never interested in not communicating. Right? He has that quote about how he told his camera operator or his DP to shoot something out of focus. He goes, shoot it out of focus. I'm trying to win like best foreign film or something. Like, he thought.
That's so true. That's amazing.
Yeah, isn't it? But he was all about communication, and that was a conviction, right? That's a philosophy. My job is to communicate. My job is to do the best job I can to tell the truth about this situation or these people or about human behavior. I've mentioned it before, and I swear he must have heard somebody say this. I swear he must have. But in the apartment, when Shirley MacLaine's character, she's having an affair with this guy, And then he has to go back to his wife, and she's wiping away tears, and she says, you know, a woman in love with a married man shouldn't wear mascara.
God, try to write that.
yeah.
Go home and try to write something half as good as I knew it, man. As soon as you started saying that, I was like, oh God. Try to do it.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's
impossible.
impossible.
It's crazy because it's so precise.
Yep.
There's no, it's like when you talk about an arrow, it doesn't make, it's the perfect, like what else, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Also,
nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
Like, how do you write nobody's perfect?
Well, there's also in that there's also, and I think I mentioned this before again on the show, but different context. But that's also in the scene where the Fred McMurray, the guy she's having the affair with, says, you know, I didn't have time to get you a gift. It's Christmas time. I didn't have time to get you a gift. And he hands her money, and he says, you know, get yourself something nice. You know, they have some nice bags at Bergdorf's or whatever. And she looks at the money, and then she starts to take off her sweater or something, and he's like, what are you doing? I've got to go. And she goes, well, I figured as long as it was paid for. And that tells you so much about how she's feeling about herself in this situation.
The compact.
Forget about it. The guy.
Forget about it.
Yeah. But
I'm telling you, I think when he tells that story, and he said, and I've been trying to do that ever since, he made a promise. Mm-hmm. He exchanged his life. His life was on the line, and he made a promise.
Yeah.
Right? Some good ones. And he said, that's what I've been trying to do ever since that day.
Yep.
When you have that kind of conviction, he's like, I made a promise to a person, and I don't remember their name.
Yeah.
And you talk about fulfilling your you talk about, like, honoring your promises.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm just saying these people we're talking about were working out of something. Was it Rod Serling? George Stevens, same thing. What made him famous? Right? What made him famous was he was all about how life actually worked.
Right.
So comedy was always just like, he was working for, what's his name, on the Laurel Hardy stuff, and they would fight about it. Is it Rex? Oh, God. It was the guy who was doing all the big comedies. It'll come to me. He's huge.
Was he producing?
Yeah, producing.
Was it Hal Roach?
Producer.
Was it Hal Roach? Yeah.
Hal Roach and him used to fight because Hal Roach was always like, make the gag bigger. You know, have the car run up the tree and flip or whatever. And he was like, no. I want to find the humor in real interactions. Mm-hmm. I want to find the humor in real life. Like, I don't want to do these crazy over-the-top gags. And he always had this really strong sense of it's human. This is a human thing.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I'm saying? And it's funny because when you're talking about telling the truth, the way that Billy did it, well, he did it the same. He did it in his way. Right? Which he was always looking for the truth. You see it. Diary of Anne Frank is crazy, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's some stuff in the Diary of Anne Frank. Like, I mean, it's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what these people were do, the way they were thinking about it. It wasn't a job. You know what I mean?
It wasn't a job, and it wasn't for fame, and it wasn't for money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were happy to make money, and they maybe were happy to be famous, but that wasn't, why they were doing what they were doing. They thought their job was more important than that.
Yeah.
Particularly those people who came back from the war, but I think even before, I think people had convictions, and I think that they were personal. I think now convictions are supposed to be public, right?
Mm-hmm.
Performative.
Ooh, that's good. Talk about that. Unpack that.
Well, I mean, you have something like Black Lives Matter, which is a thing right now, which I'm glad it is, but there are people putting it on websites and people tweeting about it who I know don't believe it. And some of those people I've dealt with, so I know they don't believe it. Right. Mm-hmm. So, but it's performative. I'm okay. Right. It's not a personal thing.
Yeah. Virtue signaling. Yeah.
Right. And I don't think, I'm sure that's always been a thing. Don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's anything new under the sun. I'm sure it's always been a thing, but we haven't had so much access to putting things out there right? We haven't had so much access. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have Instagram. We didn't have all these things where we could say, look at me, be virtuous. Right? And in some cultures, like, that's completely frowned on, right?
Well, remember, we talk about it where it's like you can't call it a value if it doesn't cost you something.
Right.
If right now it doesn't cost you anything, it's like, well, that's very convenient.
Right.
Right? Every one of these people we're talking about, it cost George Stevens, it cost Rod Serling, it
Right.
cost Billy Wilder, it cost these people something to be this way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It costs.
It's almost like, you figure out your convictions. You figure out your convictions by going, what would cost me the most right now?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Right? It's like when you were talking about, and we'll talk about this new cool series that you're doing later on, you were talking about this writer that you're going to end up interviewing, and I know we can discuss it more later, but you want to talk about what show she was on and how she got her job?
Yeah. So it looks like we're going to get her on this new show, hopefully. And Treva Silverman she was a writer on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And she used to, from what I understand, used to play piano and tell jokes or something, and caught the attention of some people. And anyway, James L. Brooks, who created the Mary Tyler Moore Show with Alan Burns, saw her or somehow found out about her and approached her and said, you know what, we want you to write on this show, and we want you to write as many of them as you'd like to write. It's really cool. She's really cool, and she wrote some really great episodes of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. But what I really admire about the two men who were charged with creating that show they like write a show for Mary Tyler Moore, so they had to create this show, and then when they were staffing it up, they sought out women to write the show, and that was not easy to do. There were no women in the pipeline then. There weren't that many women writers in TV. And so they had to find women who maybe weren't that experienced, but they trained them and they taught them how to write the show. And they wrote some amazing shows, honest
one of the great
shows
shows of all time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, they and just that their conviction to get it right and tell the truth, because they were about telling the truth too. Instead of being men trying to imitate what they think women were thinking and how they were feeling, they just asked women in the room, hey, is that true? Right? They would ask, is that true? And then they would listen, right? Which is the other component that is often missing, right? Then they would listen. That's an important thing. And that makes that show seem unbelievably truthful and honest. And sometimes, sometimes funny and sometimes not funny, and sometimes serious and funny all at the same time in the same moment. Yeah.
But that right there, that cost them something.
Yeah.
I mean, you were saying, we were talking about this earlier, and you're like, they were doing that in the 70s. There's not people doing that now.
Right. Yeah. In 1970, they did that. But people don't do that now. And if they do it, it's because they feel forced to do it. Here's an interesting thing, and I hope this changes. I spent a long time trying to get a staff job on television shows, and it did not occur. But I spent a long time trying to do that, or to get a monthly comic book job or whatever, but none of those things happened. But it was like here's what I want to say. Now they have a diversity program for television shows, right? So they have these writers, and I would hear this because I'm no longer, trying to break down that door in the same way. So I didn't know how it was working now. But what I would hear was, there are people of color who are in the first season of a show, but they don't seem to stick around, and so they don't get promoted, and they don't, and so it's like, well, that seems weird. I wonder what's going on there. Well, it turns out in these diversity programs, the show doesn't have to pay for that diversity writer, that diversity hire.
Huh.
The network pays for that diversity hire. right? They pay for it. So it doesn't come out of the budget of the show.
Wow, interesting. I didn't know that.
Second season, they would have to pay. Yeah, they would have to pay that diversity hire. And so then they end up letting them go.
Wow.
Yeah. Mindy Kaling talks about that actually on interview. I think a Fresh Air, she talks about it. But yeah, that's what happens. And so that's not really hiring people, is it? That's not really giving people an opportunity, is it? That's something else.
Yeah.
That's not about your convictions. You
Yeah.
know? And how welcome do you feel if that's the pattern and you're the diversity hire and you know that people don't really think you belong there and they're going to probably cut you loose.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's not the best situation for you to do your best work. Right?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Maybe. And so that they can say, well, we had them and they didn't do, they can say whatever, but I hope that changes, but that's the way business is done right now.
I mean, we were talking about this, Brian, like we've talked about individual directors. We talked about producers that had conviction. We talked about what would it be like if there was a studio that had some actual conviction, right? Like that had some actual conviction around the purpose of stories, the power of stories, right? Like what the world needs, as human beings, understanding the species enough to know, like putting out medicine instead of poison. Like, we talked about this, like, how could that not work? Like if you had a studio, right? Like your book, The Golden Theme, right? If you had a studio, it was like, this is what we're doing. We're taking the golden theme and we're going to find new and interesting ways to tell this story across TV and film, and there was a focus to a studio, because there used to be a focus to studios.
Yeah.
You knew what you were going to get from Universal, you knew what you were going to get from Warner Brothers, you knew, right?
Yeah.
And we're like, imagine that, seeing a conviction at that level around what they were putting out. It would be crazy. Well, you see that with chefs, right?
Yes.
Like there'll be a famous chef and the conviction behind their food, and all of a sudden you're like, you got to go to this restaurant. I mean, the food's insane, but also the way they prepare it and the way that they treat people, it's dynamite. There's a conviction behind it. There's this chef, right? Imagine having that in a studio.
Yeah, that would be amazing. You can see it with individual writers, right? Or individual directors sometimes. So you can
Liberty could have been that.
Right, Liberty Films. Yeah, Liberty
Films could have been that. Yeah.
Yeah. But you see it, well, Rod Serling's a really good example, right? Rod Serling wanted to tell the story of the lynching of Emmett Till that happened in 1955. And, he was writing on television, Rod Serling, live television, and he wanted to address that Emmett Till. It really bothered him. That was the George Floyd of its day, right? And it really bothered him, and he wanted to write about it, and the networks wouldn't let him write about it. But he had real convictions, and it bothered them that he couldn't write about things that he was concerned about. And it made him crazy. And so he eventually, that's why he created the Twilight Zone, because he could hide what he wanted to talk about.
So smart.
It's really smart. You just hide it. So, but his convictions didn't go anywhere. He didn't stop trying to say something. He believed that was his job.
And he just found a way to say it.
Yeah. And that's also a really good example of, telling the truth, but not necessarily the facts, right? Because the Twilight Zone isn't factual. It's truthful.
Yep.
Right? Like if you watch The Obsolete Man, that episode, it's truthful.
Oh, yeah. You can't actually, transfer your consciousness to a younger body.
Right, yeah.
But he tells the truth.
Right.
Right? And that one, like, I just think it's that idea of like, man, know who you are. Like I would say for whoever the person was, that there was a comment that was left on the last episode of a writer who, for a number of reasons, honestly, it sounds like mostly it's just racism, right? Stopped writing, and how he was like, dude, I'm going to start writing again. We talked about this. I just want him to know that, like, you and I talked about this. We can't get a bigger comp like that right there.
Right.
Makes the show worth it.
Right. That person
You know
now
what I
is
mean?
going to write again.
He's
Right.
like, I'm going to start writing because the world needs his stories.
Right.
Right. Right. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, you have conviction. I know you can just tell from the what he said on the comment that he has conviction. Right.
Yeah.
He has a perspective, and it's like, don't bury that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, keep going, keep writing. The world needs your perspective. They need your conviction. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah.
Like, it's huge. I mean, I'm telling you, when we talked about that, was that not, we're like, well, that's it.
Yeah. Well, how does it get better than that, right? To give somebody permission to be themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a huge
Which
thing.
is what all these people with conviction were doing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They knew who they were, and because of that, they knew what to do. What I would love to see is people who know who they are, and they're willing to work out of that conviction, even when it costs them something.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, you know, I can go on and on about the Andy Griffith Show, and I will. But the Andy Griffith Show, is really focused, almost in this way that you're talking about, like if a studio was focused this way. And Andy, there are a couple of things with Andy Griffith. I call him Andy like we were pals. I never met Andy. But Andy had this thing. For one of the first things is he had worked on Broadway a little bit. Was in a play, No Time for Sergeants. Anyway, but he didn't have that much experience on TV or whatever. And he was on this TV show, and there was lots of yelling and screaming. And he said, he goes, I don't think I can do TV. If this is what TV is behind the scenes, you know, just yelling and screaming at each other. Because if this is what TV is, then I don't think I can do this. I don't need this. And Sheldon Leonard, who was the producer, and became the producer of the, he was a pretty serious producer, Sheldon Leonard, but he produced the Andy Griffith Show as well. And he said to Andy, he goes, well, your show will be your show. And the attitude of the show will be your attitude. If you don't want yelling and screaming, then don't do that, and it won't happen. And he said, that's the way it was. That's the way it was. So he learned that. He had a conviction. He was ready to walk away from TV. Like, you know what? Forget it. Forget it. I don't need to be on TV this bad. This is not an atmosphere I want to work in. Right. In fact, he only lost his temper one day that I know of on the set. And that was the day that Kennedy was shot.
Oh, geez.
He lost his temper. He was like banging on stuff. And the people said that was the one day he lost it. It was bad, but that was the one day. And they stopped shooting for the rest of the day. And, but he had real convictions. And the other conviction, I think, is that Andy was a Christian, and he was serious about it. And Andy said, I want every story, he said this to the writers, I want every show to have a Bible lesson. Now, there are Bible people and people who aren't Bible people, and that's not really the point of that story to me. Mm-hmm. The point of that story is that he had conviction, and the other thing is that you don't have to know that to watch the show and appreciate the show, because it's not preaching at you, it's dramatizing these ideas. Right. It's dramatizing these ideas. And
almost all those ideas are universal ideas that you would find, you know, love thy neighbor. You're going to find that in all sorts of different philosophies. And, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And how should you treat a stranger?
About, like the Dove episode, or it's like you're going to find it's not. It was never preachy.
Right.
I guess is right.
Yeah.
But focused.
Yeah.
And he had something he was willing to sacrifice for.
Yeah.
How often do you see work now where you go like, man, that must have really cost that person a lot to... I remember watching an episode of Cheers, like an early episode of Cheers. And it was the episode where they were trying to figure out who was gay. Do you remember that episode?
Yeah, somebody was gay. They knew somebody was gay. Yeah.
And they were trying to figure out who. And I remember when I watched that episode going like, I bet that cost them a lot to do that episode. Mm-hmm. Back then?
Yeah.
It was probably not a popular... I bet you that was not an easy episode to get on air. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
And just, you know, it's just interesting.
Well, they, going back to the Mary Tyler Moore show, mm-hmm. There were two characters, the character of Rhoda and Rhoda's mother, who appears early on in the first season mm-hmm. in a really great episode called Support Your Local Mother. It's a really good episode. But anyway, and won an Emmy and everything. But before that, the network thought that those characters were way too Jewish. Their code for Too Jewish was To New York.
Oh, interesting. To New York.
Yeah, To New York, but they meant Too Jewish. And didn't want to put the shows on. Didn't want to do it. But Grant Tinker, who was the producer of the Mary Tyler Moore Show, Grant Tinker said, you just go ahead and do your show. You shoot it. You do your show. I will make sure it gets on the air. Because he always fought for his people. And so he did. He went to the mat and they put it on, the show. And the show, the show's won more Emmys than any other show, I think, 27 or 26 or something. So it worked. And those characters became very, very popular characters, actually. The characters who were too Jewish became very popular. But they risked something, right? They risked to do it. So it doesn't necessarily have to cost you anything, but you have to risk it costing you something.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Are you willing to risk it? Right? And they were willing to risk it.
Yep.
Which is almost always where the glory is, too, in that risk. You know what I mean? Whenever you play it safe. I mean, we talk about this a lot, but I think the Nike thing with Colin Kaepernick, that was risky.
Yeah.
That was risky.
Yeah, when they did it, 100%.
And it was all about conviction. They did it before George Floyd and, when everybody, no, they did it because of their convictions.
And the way that actually got greenlit, because I actually got in an argument with a very powerful advertising executive over that. It had just come out and I was talking to this person and I was like, it's really amazing they ran that. And this person was, she was like, well, I guarantee you they focus grouped it and I guarantee you that they ran it through the board and all these things. I was like, I don't know. I don't know if it just doesn't feel like that. And then later on it came out that what actually happened was the idea had been pitched and Mr. Knight, who started Nike, knew about it and people were discussing it. And then he was on the phone with his friend, LeBron James. And LeBron James was talking about how his son just got his driver's license. And how he was terrified that his son's going to get murdered because his son's driving around in this nice car because he's LeBron James' son. And Mr. Knight got off the phone with his buddy and was like, this is bullshit. And he called him and was like, run the ad. That's how it happened.
Yeah.
So it's not even like it was just like, no, this can't, whatever. Yeah. I don't care. It ended up, their stock ended up going up and all that stuff. But nobody would have known that, and granted, you can say things like the people that didn't like Nike after that, 50-year-old white guys are not the demographic that would be. I get all that argument, but at the same time, understand that it's still extremely risky.
Yeah,
extremely risky. Yeah,
yeah, right.
And it ends up, literally. And it's funny too because I remember when we were watching that spot, you said it was interesting because the reaction was people were burning things. They were burning all their Nike stuff, and you said something like, "Don't miss the fact that everything's getting burned."
Yeah. Because burning is violent.
What did you mean by that?
I mean, it's violent. That there was a violent response, right? They could have thrown their shoes away.
Mm-hmm. Or donated them to somebody.
Or donated them, right? Yeah. They could have done a lot of things if they just wanted to get rid of their Nikes. Burning them was violence.
Yeah.
And it was violence for show.
Yeah.
Look at me burn these.
Yes.
Right? That's a different
thing. By
the
way, it's a commercial. So if you get triggered off of a commercial to where you're going to burn hundreds of dollars worth of Nike shoes, we're talking about something bigger going on than a commercial.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if your reaction is I need to build a bonfire in my backyard.
Yeah.
Right? And burn my basketballs and all this. It's like, this isn't about basketballs. This isn't about running shoes.
Right. Well, right. I mean, think about what burning. The Nazis burned things, right?
That's what I'm saying, man.
The Nazis burned.
I was thinking about burning crosses. Burning is a deal. It's a thing.
Yeah. When somebody says we're going to light this on fire,
what did we do to witches? Right? Yeah. Burning is a thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Burning gay people. Right?
It's a thing.
It's a thing. Right. Yeah. No, burning is violence. It's an act of violence. It's an act of performative violence.
Yep, that's right.
And
so it's even the brands that actually have some real conviction are the only ones in the future that I think are going to win. That actually, no bullshit, not because they focus grouped it or any of that. If you look at the history of a company like Patagonia, they've had conviction from day one.
Mm-hmm.
You think it's a coincidence that it's like, and every day, what is stories? Stories exist to, right, to impart survival information, right? But what is the goal of a story? A goal of the story is to prove. It's to prove that survival information, right?
Right.
Well, if a goal of a brand is to know who you are and to prove every single day that that's actually what you believe in. This is who we are. This is what we stand for.
Yeah.
And when you don't live up to that, you apologize. But your job is you need to know who you are so you know what to stand for, right? Because your philosophy is up here, and out of that comes your tactics. Out of that
Right.
comes the rules or whatever. Because Andy knew who he was,
Yep.
he can go, wait a second. These end up being the principles of my show,
Yeah.
right? If it makes a liar out of the character, I'm not doing it. Boom, 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 and you'd be like,
Yeah.
man, those rules that he put over the show made such a great show. Well, the only way that you can come up with those rules is because there's a higher thing.
Right.
That higher thing is your belief system, your philosophy, whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
Again, when you know who you are, you know what to do. And it would be so amazing to see imagine if there was the Patagonia of movie theater, or I'm sorry, of movie studios,
Right.
right? What
Yeah.
would happen? You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
and we live in a time where it's you just don't see that kind of conviction coming out anymore, unless it's performative or whatever. Like, but just like what Rod Serling was doing, George Stevens, and there's been a ton of people like that. It's not like,
Right.
There's been a lot of amazing artists, and
Well, Stanley Kramer was like that.
Hmm.
Right. Now, what's
well,
interesting,
set up who's
Stanley Kramer, it was a producer and a director. Did a lot of work in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. I think retired in the early 80s or something like that. But Stanley Kramer made a lot of movies about race and race relations. Now, I think they're clumsy movies, most of them. I think they don't work, most of them. I think they're over the top, and sometimes they don't dramatize as well as they preach. Having said that, the idea that he had some convictions is still, I think that still matters. And I think his films did make an impact, and sometimes a positive impact, and sometimes, so but then there are things
but you can't fault the guy for trying.
No, you can't. You can't. Yeah, I think that he did have convictions, and I think that matters. And there are plenty of people who maybe make films on the same level, quality-wise, but have no conviction. So their works, right, by virtue of not having any conviction. But he did do things like Judgment at Nuremberg. He directed, which I think is his best movie. But he did a movie called The Defiant Ones, and The Defiant Ones. The Defiant Ones is not the best movie, but it was a really cool idea for a movie, and there's cool things in it, but it just doesn't work. But it was a very popular movie when it came out, and it's two prisoners are being transported, and one's black and one's white, and they're chained together, and then there's an accident, and they're able to escape, and so they're on the run, and in order to survive, they're chained together. They have to learn how to tolerate each other and get along, and that's and so it's
a brilliant idea for a movie.
It is it's a better idea for a movie than a movie, but there's some cool things in it. There's some cool things in it.
That's a good way of saying it. It's a better idea for a movie than a movie. That's great.
Yeah. But it's but there are some good work in it. There's some interesting work in it. I mean, to have that idea that no, we're chained together in order to survive.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. But that was Stanley Kramer. He did things like that. But it's not all he did. He did other things, but he had real convictions. And I just think it's funny. I talked to my friend Stuart about this because, he was doing he did a movie called The Ugly American with Marlon Brando. And it had a lot of interesting things about the United States and how the United States operates, and sometimes not all the best ways that we operate. And I was talking to him about the 70s and the convictions that people had in the 70s in their films. I thought there were some real convictions. And I said, what was happening? What was in the air then? Why were people doing that? And he said he thought it was part of a continuum. He said, no, that was happening, and it was just building momentum. It was just part of a continuum. It was happening in the 50s. It was happening in the 60s. It was just happening. So he didn't feel like it was a moment as much as it was just a progression.
Hmm.
And so, but I think that went away probably mid 80s.
Yeah.
That idea that you should have something to say. Then it just became getting butts in seats, you know, in the summertime, you know,
right.
You know, and that's it. Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think the actionable thing from this episode is I really hope that people can take away is like, know who you are. That's step one, right? A lot of times that comes through trauma or something like that's where you really figure out your survival information that you are uniquely there to give, right? A lot of times when we talk about normally in the nature of the medicine grows near the poison, a lot of times you figure out almost in every one of these examples we've given today, for the most part, right? And so it's like, what is that story you have to tell? What is that story that you could put out there that would genuinely help other people? And how do you tell the truth about that? And sometimes you tell the truth about that by making it about animals and talking animals. Or sometimes you get to figure that out. But first, know who you are, then you'll know what to do. Yeah. And when you bring that kind of conviction to your work, it will last, right? And at the very least, it will be different because there's almost nobody with any conviction out there anymore.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I was thinking about an animal story. A lot of the animal stories, for some reason, we think of animal stories as for kids. I don't know why. For most of human history, that wasn't true. And there's a story, it's an African story about these animals all playing, like these baby animals were playing. And they're kind of playing around the elephants. And one of the elephants stomps a lion cub and kills it, like just stomps it and kills it. And so all the animals go to the lion and they say, because he runs the show, and they go to the lion and they say, we're sorry somebody's killed your son. And the lion's like, oh, okay, well then whoever it is going to pay for this. This is it. There's no way. They're not going to live through this. I want my revenge. And he said, who did this? Who killed my son? And they say the elephants did it. And he says, no, it wasn't the elephants. It was the goats, right? It was the goats that did it. And I thought about that story when when Bush started wars with people that didn't attack us, right? It was the goats that did it, right?
Yeah.
Right? That's a way of telling the truth, right? So this story is way older than that, right? This is an old story that says, oh yeah, people will often not attack the thing they're afraid of or the thing that's too big. Yeah. They may attack, but you know.
Well, the real problem, it's not the elephants, it's the immigrants. You know, the real problem, it's not this, it's the Jews. You know, the real problem is that pick a fucking lane.
Right.
Because whoever is vulnerable, predators go after the vulnerable.
Yeah.
And when you see someone going after vulnerable people, understand this, they're a predator. That's how this shit works. Right?
Right.
If you in nature, watch who gets hunted. It'll be the one animal that's got a limp. It's the one animal that probably needs more compassion and more help.
Right.
Is who gets attacked.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Nobody walks up to Muhammad Ali and pushes him. Bad move. You know what I'm saying?
Right, yeah.
You don't do that. It's not how bullies work, and bullies are cowards.
Right.
And that's how it always has been, and that's how it always will be.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
It took me a long time to figure out that was true. Because that makes no sense when you're a kid. They're a bully, they're a coward. I'm like, that doesn't seem like cowardice, but as you get older, you're like, oh, that is complete cowardice. Yes. It's complete cowardice. Yeah. And that's all it is. That's just the way it's manifesting itself, but it's cowardice.
That's right.
Yeah. It's a really interesting, I think for younger people that can be hard to understand. Here's
the thing, just to put a point on it, you got to know what you're willing to die for.
Yeah.
You have to know. Dr. King talked about that.
Yeah.
Like a man who is not willing to die for anything isn't willing to live for anything, right? It was like he said it better than that.
He said a man who doesn't have something he would die for isn't fit to live.
Fit to live, that's right.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Maybe that's where you start with your conviction as you're figuring out your next story.
Yeah.
Right? What would you die for?
Right.
You know? Like, figure out what you'd die for. Whatever that thing is, you should write about that shit.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because it's going to be fire. And it's like, find that thing, right? There's something in there that will be of value to other people.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
true.
so conviction. Figure out who you are, and then you're going to know what to do. Cool? I want to talk about your new program. Okay, so this is going to live within the You're a Storyteller ecosystem. So one of the coolest things is Brian has access. Brian has a lot of crazy friends and people that are just amazing. And so because of that, Brian was willing to reach out to people and ask them if they would be interviewed. And these people are like insane people. And so you're going to notice inside of these episodes, there's going to be new episodes and there's going to be a new kind of like sub show within You're a Storyteller. So Brian, can you talk about your new show?
So the new show is You Are a Storyteller, Masters of the Craft, or Masters of Craft. I can't remember what we landed on. You'll see what it is when it comes out. And I just wanted to talk to what I have noticed over time is that every craft, no matter what it is, has something in common with other crafts. That it doesn't matter. It can be acting, it can be building, it can be whatever it is. There are some principles that seem to transcend every craft. Now, I'm mostly going to be talking to people who work, in the realm of storytelling in some way, but not exclusively. If somebody has some bit of wisdom, I want it, right? So I also, I've noticed that with some of these people, when we sit down and have a conversation, kind of like when we have a conversation, our conversations are just like the show. When we sit down and talk and hang out, they're just like the show. And I wanted to recreate that with some of these other people and some of these people who have bigger names and people know them, know their work and have a conversation with them. There are a couple of people, I haven't asked Glenn Keane to do the show yet, but I will. But there are a couple of people, like Glenn Keane is a really good example. When I was working with Glenn on a movie of his, I was helping him out a little bit. What was interesting to me was because before I started working with him, I was just a fan. That's all, and I was I just admired his craftsmanship, the level of his craft. And to be in a room working with him felt almost like a cheat. And what I mean is that I knew other people would want to be a fly on the wall. Like, how does somebody who created The Little Mermaid or The Beast and Beauty and the Beast, or how do they create? What's the thought process? How are they working? How did they learn what they know? And to be able to do that and be able to do it, to repeat it, not just do it once, right? That's craft. If you can repeat it, right? Yeah. And I thought it would be great to capture those kinds of conversations so that people can be that fly on the wall and know what people talk about on the high level. Like, what are they talking about? What are their concerns? How did they learn what they learned? Because I think there's information in there that people can use and apply to their own learning and their own.
And you already have a couple of these in the can. And what I want people to look for is, one of my favorite things about what you're doing with this, Brian, is you're not asking the questions everyone else asks. No. So it'd be the quote of, if you had Glenn Keane on, you're like, this would be an amazing question. But did you ever meet Walt Disney? Like that kind of like, okay, like if for instance, if you're interviewing somebody that worked with Marlon Brando, it's like, what was Marlon Brando? Well, that is none of the stuff you're asking.
No.
So can you talk about why because people are going to see you're getting really amazing people for the show that people are going to know. Yeah. And they might be confused of why you're not asking what was James Dean question like? Why aren't you doing that?
I'm not doing that because usually they've been interviewed about that to death, right? And and you can find it anywhere on the internet, I'm sure. If they're big enough name and they're famous for a thing, everybody's talked to them about that.
Yeah.
That's so you can find that. It's also not interesting to the person being interviewed. Like, I've answered this question a million times. It's not interesting to them. They can disengage and give you the answer they've given 100 times. But there's also no information in it in terms of craft. Like, how do you do what you do? Yes. How did you get so good at this? What do you think about? What scares you when you work? How do you work
Yeah.
through that fear, right? Those kinds of things, right? Because a lot of people want to perform at a very high level, but they have no idea how you do that,
Right.
right? How do you get to be X person or Y person, you know?
Yep.
Often I find that it is, well, it comes back to convictions. They usually have some strong conviction about why they do what they do. They've usually come to some place that allows them to think, oh, my job is X. And it's a very simple thing. And it has nothing to do with the outside world. It's an internal thing. And so I wanted to get into that. I wanted to get to the to talk to the person and talk to the craft and forget about whatever made them famous. That may come up in the conversation, but that's not the focus of the conversation.
Yep.
The focus of the conversation is how do you do what you do?
Yep.
How did you learn? How did you learn to do it? Yeah.
I'm so stoked for this, and so I just want to let people know that, so when they start to see these episodes in between our other kind of normal format episodes, they'll know what to expect. Again, can't talk about everybody that's going to be on it, but the people you've already had, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Like it's super cool, and a lot of these folks too, trying to get some folks that are also older too, who have this amazing wisdom, and we want to get it out of their heads. There's some people out there that just know unbelievable stuff, and nobody asks them.
Yeah.
And it's amazing too. So they're just freely giving it away. They're like, hey, here you go.
Yeah.
It's all right there. And so be watching for that. And also too, I want to tell people, like, your questions. I've been getting really great questions that people are submitting. We're going to get to some of those too. They're really great. And we do read them, right? And we really appreciate that. And we're so glad that people are getting something from the show. I know that just means a lot to us.
Yeah, it's more than I think we expected.
Yeah.
It's
been. And to that writer from last week, it really did. It made our day. That comment.
Yeah.
Keep writing.
Yeah, no kidding. Keep writing, and hopefully this show makes it easier for a lot of people to do whatever their craft is, to do what they think is right in their craft, to follow their convictions and to not be afraid of them and not be afraid of how hard it is in every way that it's hard. Hopefully we give some tools to people and give some confidence to people. And it seems like that's happening, and that's unbelievably rewarding. So, and it's not something I expected in the way that it's happening. So.
Yep. No, it's a gift.
Yeah.
Awesome. Know who you are, know what to do. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse.
Right.
Thanks for watching You Are a Storyteller. If you have any questions, or if there's a storytelling topic you'd like us to cover, leave a comment below or email us at hello@beliefagency.com.